I'm very happy to go to our next speaker, Jennifer Ponce de León. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. And she is an interdisciplinary scholar whose research focuses on 20th and 21st century left movements and cultural production in the Americas and Marxist anti-colonial and post-colonial thought. She works across studies of visual arts, literature, and performance on traditional Latinx and Latin American studies and critical theory. She's also faculty in Latin America and Latinx studies, LALS, affiliated faculty in gender, sexuality, and women's studies and cinema studies, and a member of the graduate group in comparative literature. She was the recipient of the 2020 SAS Dean's Award for distinguished teaching by an assistant professor. She is associate director of the Critical Theory Workshop, Atelier de Théorie Critique, which holds an intensive summer research program at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales in Paris every summer, which was publicized earlier by Gabriel, as well as symposia in the University of Pennsylvania. So it gives me great pleasure to invite Jennifer to make the next contribution.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'm very honored to be part of this panel with people I admire and from whom I've learned so much. I'm very grateful to the organizers, my fellow panelists, and those of you who are watching or listening. So I'm going to be building on much of what has been said, particularly the point that fascism operates as the cutting edge of imperialism and as a permutation within capitalism's colonial tradition. And I'm going to be talking about some of the ways this has manifested itself in the case of US imperialism. I've written about this in American Quarterly, where I argue that fascistic modes of governance have been integral and systemic features of US elites' class warfare, particularly as this is exercised on the country's colonized and neo-colonized populations. And this includes persons in other countries, as well as internally colonized people and neo-colonized immigrant workers residing within the US. And when in the 1960s and 70s, revolutionary Marxists like George Jackson, Kathleen Cleaver, and Angela Davis analyzed what they considered to be the fascist or proto-fascist character of the United States, they cited evidence for this in the state's racist and political repression, its anti-labor orientation, its enormous prison system and secret police force, and in its demonstrated support of the most fascist and racist regimes throughout the world. In a speech she gave in 1973 on the fascist seed within US imperialism, Angela Davis asked, "Is it not possible to say that a ruling class so willing to support fascism abroad will not find it difficult to resort to fascist tactics at home, especially if it is a question of rescuing themselves and their profits?" Now, Jackson argued that the US had already become the prototype of the international fascist counter-revolution. Curry Mallet has critiqued Jackson's lack of appreciation for the important difference between a liberal state with fascistic practices and a state that eliminates all bourgeois democratic rights. And this distinction is, of course, absolutely crucial. But at the same time, we also must be able to see that these fascistic practices that Jackson and Davis were talking about are systemic, institutionalized, and rooted in the political economy of US capitalism and imperialism. And we also have to be able to see that the exercise of US imperialism has historically entailed the denial of bourgeois democratic rights, as well as basic human rights to people around the world. We are seeing this happen in real time in Palestine, and we have seen this in the funding and training of anti-communist dictators, police forces, and death squads across the third world. So I'm going to talk briefly about this history in Latin America and the Caribbean being schematic out of necessity. Now, in the wake of the Mexican and Bolshevik revolutions, the region saw a wave of progressive and revolutionary governments come to power, bringing democratization, in some cases land reform, and efforts at national development to break out of their economy's conditions of dependency and underdevelopment. The success of the Cuban Revolution catalyzed the spread of armed revolutionary movements across the region. Now, given the degree to which US imperialism had dominated Latin America and the Caribbean economically and militarily since the 19th century, all of these progressive movements, both reformist and revolutionary, were all struggles for national self-determination against US imperialism. And this was occurring in the context where the growth of socialism around the world took about a third of this population out of the orbit of US-led imperialism, which itself entered into a cyclical crisis in the early 1970s. So what follows on the part of both local Latin American and US elites is what is aptly described by Domenico Losurdo as a neo-colonial, neoliberal counter-revolution. In Latin America, the US state, and particularly the CIA, worked with local comprador elites to overthrow leftist governments throughout Latin America and the Caribbean and put in their place military dictatorships friendly to the US Capitol and the Pentagon. With US support, these regimes dissolved democratic institutions, suspended rights, organized death squads, and extrajudicially kidnapped, tortured, and assassinated hundreds of thousands of people, while forcing many more into exile. In addition to terrorism, they also used their state's legal mechanisms in their attempts to not simply destroy revolutionary communist movements, but also to break the power of organized labor, roll back gains workers had already achieved, and preempt opposition to the sweeping macroeconomic and policy reforms that they imposed by fiat, including trade liberalization, financialization, concessions to foreign capitalists, anti-worker reforms to labor law, and so forth. Now, these US-backed regimes were at the time and have been understood by many to be fascist. Others have classified them as authoritarian. The distinction is made around the degree to which they relied principally on an expanding repressive apparatus of the state associated with authoritarianism versus a degree to which they had support from sectors of civil society associated with fascism. Now, as Andre Gunder Frank argued, this distinction mattered for acknowledging that these military regimes ultimately responded to the dictates of foreign capital at the expense of their national populations, so they could not drum up significant support from the latter. Nonetheless, such regimes did have the support of local capitalists who benefited enormously from their brutal assaults on labor. They also often had support drummed up for them by the church. And it is also the case that these regimes engaged in extensive propaganda to legitimate themselves with civil society, often by fabricating fears of a savagely violent, atheist, immoral, totalitarian communist threat against which they were supposedly defending their people. And what these regimes shared with every other fascist force in the world was their virulent anti-communism, antipathy to democracy, alignment with the interests of capital and imperialism, and their use of violent and repressive means to overcome the power of workers and peasants, and to attempt to destroy any seeds of socialism. Now, the savagery of their violence has been understood by many legal authorities to constitute crimes against humanity, and in some cases, genocide. And in places where indigenous people constituted a large part of the popular classes, this political violence had a distinctly racist and colonial character. Scorched earth tactics used on peasant villages were also used as means to dispossess peasants of their lands. Now, the US state, often through the CIA, supported this violence in myriad ways, from arming and training death squads, educating them in torture and terrorism, and providing international coordination among these different regimes. Israel was also instrumental in supplying arms and training. French officers disseminated techniques they had learned in their colonial war on Algerians. And this transnational network that brought state terrorism to Latin American workers also included bona fide Nazi officers like Klaus Barbie, who the US sent to Bolivia to shelter him from prosecution in Europe. Now, Latin American states' transition to liberal constitutional regimes in the 80s and 90s illustrate what Gramsci analyzed as the perfect division of labor between fascism and democracy. Gramsci argued that ruling classes use fascism to destroy the organizational edifice and centers of organic unity of the working class, and sow terror among the people. Once the strength of peasants and workers has been rendered ineffective, democratic institutions can be rehabilitated. In such conditions, Gramsci wrote, quote, so-called liberal bourgeois groups can, without fear of fatal repercussions on the internal cohesion of state and society, separate their responsibilities from those of the fascism which they armed, encouraged, and incited to struggle against the workers. Indeed, in many cases, democratic neoliberal governments carried forward the same economic policies as their dictatorial predecessors, often under the pressure of the IMF and World Bank, who used debt to force structural adjustment programs on these countries. Now, the effects of these, decades of these neo-colonial, neoliberal policies include unprecedented inequality, the massive dispossession of small landholders, the immiseration of workers, economic dependency, and stunted national development, as Latin American countries were essentially made to be suppliers of unprocessed natural resources and cheap labor for foreign markets and corporations. Now, we have, of course, seen important struggles against this neoliberal, neocolonial model, most notably in the Bolivarian Revolution and other Alba states, the Pink Tide, and subsequent progressive electoral victories. But we have also seen the continued readiness of US and Latin American elites to attempt to quash democratic processes in order to regain power. Though lawfare has become a new favored weapon in their toolbox, they also continue to use familiar means like coups and economic warfare in the form of sanction and blockades that is aimed to promote regime change. And they also are more than willing to support thuggish local leaders who are apologists for or even former functionaries of recent dictatorships. These elites rely on the repression of the popular classes, for which the US and Israel continue to provide funding and training. And much of this infrastructure of repression has been built up under the aegis of the war on drugs or the war on terrorism. Now, since I'm considering fascism's relation to US imperialism, before closing, I want to turn to one other arena in which this is evidenced, which is the contemporary war on immigrants. Now, US-led economic and military imperialism in Latin America and the Caribbean, whose contours I have very briefly outlined, bears huge responsibility for creating conditions that have caused millions of people to migrate to the US to look for work in order to survive and to ensure the survival of their families. And the US state increasingly governs this transnational reserve army of labor through incarceration, policing, deportation, and also by promoting racialized security ideologies that help to criminalize and dehumanize immigrant workers. Now, despite the ubiquity of anti-immigrant racism in US culture, the country's ruling classes have long relied on federal immigration policy to recruit and control labor that meets their needs, as well as to remove workers when they become superfluous to these needs or potentially destabilizing. Immigration and border policies also organize and enforce rights-differentiated and racialized hierarchies among workers. This not only divides workers, diminishing our collective power, it also creates a group of highly controlled, vulnerable workers whose lack of rights make them available to more intense exploitation. And this, in turn, pushes wages down for all workers. Now, historically, guest worker programs have created segregated groups of workers who are deprived of fundamental civil and political rights. But a similar arrangement is now maintained by the criminalization of immigrants and the socially powerful workforce it provides. Since the 80s, both parties of the US federal government have pursued policies that have expanded the criminalization, deportation, and imprisonment of vast number of immigrants, making immigrant workers imprisoned for unlawful entry the fastest growing sector of the US prison population, and making immigrant prosecutions the largest share of federal prosecutions nationwide. Immigrants are afforded very few of the legal protections citizens have. They are typically denied access to legal representation and tried en masse. And the caging and militarized control of migrants, which is a growth industry worth tens of billions of dollars, is a growing component of the US military prison industrial complex, which not only names a set of institutions, but also a course of economic development and political decision-making. Corporations involved in border militarization, detention, and deportation logistics lobby policymakers to push for laws that further criminalize immigrants and expand the use of immigration detention. Justin Akers-Chacon has convincingly argued that the repression of immigrants and refugees is a leading edge of international fascism in our current conjuncture, as it is used to build up police states, abet profiteering from repression, and proliferate racist ideologies and parastate violence. Chacon, Mike Davis, and Brendan O'Connor have all written about the symbiotic relationship between fascist and anti-immigrant vigilante organizations, powerful capitalists, and state policymakers. Dubbing this border fascism, O'Connor has mapped the networks of nativist think tanks and militias that push punitive immigration policy, while also exposing their leaders' embrace of fascist and racist ideologies. He also argues that with increased climate change-induced migration, we will see ever-intensifying criminalization and repression of migrant workers. So I just want to close by underscoring these authors' arguments that the repression we see of migrants in the US and around the world is a cutting edge of contemporary fascism that evinces imperialist elites' increasing reliance on the militarized control of workers more generally. Thank you.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.